Good morning, Commissioners. My name is Mary Stevens, and I live in East Cobb County. And I wanted to speak to you about the issue of the park and keeping the name of General Joseph Johnston, a Confederate general, and keeping that in the title of the park. Now, I'm submitting to you some information here. I don't know if you're aware of this or not, but on the sheets, there's a graph that's in pink and blue, and it shows you the number of free African Americans after the war from 1790 to 1860. And you see in the graph that every year, every decade, there was an increase of free Africans in the South as opposed in the North. So had it been so bad for the freed slaves, they would have left the South. At the bottom of that picture is another picture of some African Americans at Confederate reunions. And as you can see, they are lined up there and they're sitting down, and they have their pins on their lapels and so forth from the different reunions they attended. These African Americans performed for the Confederacy as cooks, laborers, chaplains, in any way they could. On the front of the material that I've given you is some quotes from a famous African American speaker and economist, Thomas Sowell. He said that more whites were brought as slaves to North Africa than blacks brought as slaves to the United States or to the 13 colonies. White slaves were still being brought and sold in the Ottoman Empire for decades after African Americans were freed in the United States. He goes on to say that every race and culture throughout history has either had slaves or been slaves at one time or another. And notice in the picture here on this chart, there were, in the Confederacy, we had African Americans, Irish, Jewish, Native Americans, Hispanics, and so forth. Now, naming the park is anything that does not include the name of General Joseph Johnston is historically inaccurate. He served with honors in the Mexican-American War, the Seminole Wars, and a quartermaster in general in California. He had no slaves and was fighting because he was a general and that he was trained at West Point to fight. He was the original commander of the Army of Northern Virginia. He employed his withdrawal strategies to defend the Union General Sherman's advance from Chattanooga to Atlanta, and defeated Sherman at the Battle of Kennesaw Mountain. After the war, he was a railroad president and served as a commissioner of railroads under President Grover Cleveland. The Atlanta area was invaded, so General Johnston, like any one of us in this room, would defend his homeland and try to fortify their homeland any way they could. A friend of mine said this about the park: over the last 40 years, I've witnessed the destruction of so many historical sites, Johnston's River Line being one of the most famous. In the 70s, it remains intact. A few homes were directly on the line, but mainly on Oakdale Road leading up to Fair Oaks. You could eyeball relics all along the line if you knew what to look for. The construction boom of the 80s destroyed most of the earthworks. At the corner of Bankhead and New Discovery Boulevard stood one of the most extensive works of the entire war. You could, in the 70s, trace the footsteps of the soldiers. The road that, if you take a ride down Stanley Road, just north of Kennesaw Mountain, the road was the main federal line that ran from Kennesaw to Dallas Highway. Sherman had over 100,000 men camped on the location before the assault on Kennesaw Mountain, completely destroyed in the name of progress. The war was not about slavery. Read Lincoln's inaugural address in which he said he was fighting to keep the Union, not slavery. Georgia was named after King George II, who approved of slavery. Should we change the name of our state? America was
Ma'am,
named
thank
after the
you.
explorer, Amerigo Vespucci,
Ma'am, your
who
time has
took
expired.
slaves during his voyages. Women did
Ma'am,
not have
ma'am,
opportunity to
ma'am,
vote.
Your time is up. Thank you very much.
Okay. We'll just keep the name of General Johnston. Thank
You
you.
have a question? Sure, go ahead.
The naming of the park will be held for another meeting, as there certainly have been some additional voices that have come to light with respect to the park. And we've just had another voice shared here today. I recognize that there is variation in the sentiment that people have with respect to the park. But I want to make it very clear that some of the issues that were brought up this morning, particularly with respect to slavery, is part of the reason why there is a desire for neutrality in the name. I was deeply offended by some of the statements that were made this morning by the previous speaker. I'm not here to refute the fact that there may have been slaves other than persons who are African American, but there is numerous documentation and historical evidence that the chattel slavery that Blacks were subject to in America was not comparable to that of any other race. And I also want to address the point that had it been so bad for slaves, they would have left the South. I find that statement also equally offensive. And this is part of the reason why, again, there has been a move towards finding a neutral name for this site. I can only imagine for those that live in the area, the level of offense that they might take beyond the level of offense of which I have taken just now. And I appreciate there being difference of perspective, but it's just very clear that this is a sensitive issue, which I just don't think was dealt with very sensitively by this previous speaker.
Okay, thank you, Commissioner.